To understand cross-class contact, we map the system's precise boundaries. A firm boundary isolates the embedded class from the outside coordinate space. Here, the incapable observer remains securely within the baseline system. Their trajectory naturally curves away, never physically reaching the boundary line. This inability to reach the edge is a mathematical absolute. The incapable observer is locked in by embedding constraints. Because of their baseline architecture, outside coordinate positions remain entirely inaccessible. The second recognized position is the failed crosser. They attempt a full physical traversal into the outside coordinate space. The result is immediate. They are violently disassembled by the external geometry. This destruction happens because traversing the boundary forcibly strips the observer of their anchor function. Without that anchor, they lose orientation entirely, and the result is total systemic fragmentation. Operating strictly within this binary model presents a massive functional gap. If most observers cannot reach it, and those who try are destroyed, cross-class contact should be structurally impossible. The geometry requires a third observer position to resolve this gap. This is an individual who holds the exact architectural capacity required to cross the threshold, but deliberately halts precisely at the edge. We define this specific coordinate position as the voluntary non-crosser. This entity is defined by what it actively preserves. They retain their coupling architecture, the exact inside class property that a full crossing would obliterate. Refusing to cross the boundary is a mandatory structural position. It keeps the cross-class contact experiment functionally intact. The observer isn't stopping out of a psychological failure of nerve. They are stopping because they recognize the exact location of the floor. We can examine exactly why the crossing fails by looking at historical models. Human history has consistently documented the structural failure mode of class crossing, but it has miscategorized these literal physics events as moral myths about hubris and ambition. Consider the Icarus myth. Remove the moral framing, and you have a strict equation detailing material mismatch at the individual scale. The Icarus wings represent inside class coupling architecture, engineered strictly for embedded class parameters. The materials function perfectly inside. Exposing them to outside coordinate parameter loads mathematically guarantees the dissolution of their load-bearing nodes. The observer falls because outside physics dissolve their materials. The Babel model demonstrates this exact structural failure mode scaled up to collective coordinated attempts. It involves a fully organized, directionally coherent group trying to exit the embedding through an accumulation of sheer effort. The embedding constraint does not respond to numbers. Adding more observers to the equation does not alter the geometric limits of the system. 1,000 Icarus instances flying together still have wings built from inside-class materials. In fact, collective crossing attempts rapidly accelerate the failure. The very act of pushing against the boundary dissolves the specific coupling architecture that allowed the group to coordinate their actions in the first place. The coordination breaks and the architecture collapses at scale. Any observer who allows their inside class architecture to dissolve in a push toward outside coordinates has destroyed the vehicle required to comprehend the destination. The reach worth making requires full use of the inside class architecture intact. The voluntary non-crosser solves the material mismatch by halting at the threshold. They position themselves directly at the edge to protect their geometric lattice from the Icarus failure state. By maintaining this securely anchored position, the observer opens a specialized reality empathy registration channel. They are capable of pulling data across the boundary and holding it in their intact lattice without physically traversing the line themselves. This introduces a major vulnerability in evaluating the framework from an external perspective. An incapable observer who never reached the threshold and a voluntary non-crosser who halted precisely at it look identical. Neither entity physically crosses the line. Self-reporting cannot resolve this indistinguishability. A self-professed claim of voluntary restraint is a mathematically invalid metric. To prove genuine cross-class capacity, we have to look strictly at downstream operations. This split-screen plot details the longitudinal signature, the only verifiable proof of the third position. Measured continuously over 7 to 21 days, we look for transferred constraint structures and this specific reality empathy depletion pattern. marking where the reservoir drains and recovers during boundary contact. This intense, verified reality empathy signature sharply contrasts with the baseline of ordinary universe empathy. If the signature is missing over a 3-week window, the threshold was never reached, regardless of how the observer frames their own position. True voluntary restraint is an active, architecturally heavy state. Operating the registration channel leaves undeniable, measurable imprints on the observer's system. Human governance structures attempt to manage threshold activity through a crude institutional analog of protective custody. The institutions operate on a correct foundational premise. Uncontrolled access to the threshold risks massive contamination and directly threatens the global coupling architecture under study. The government inherits the correct function: protect the architecture. The failure lies in the mechanism. Governments rely on threat assessment and pattern recognition, optimized for institutional survival. They lack any genuine structural understanding of the geometry they are trying to regulate. The resulting intervention protocol is highly destructive. Institutions apply overbroad force, ranging from suppression and classification to direct elimination, against any and all threshold-adjacent activity they detect. Institutional radar cannot mathematically distinguish between an active Icarus threat attempting to shatter the boundary and a perfectly stable voluntary non-crosser operating a secure registration channel. They both read as anomalies reaching toward outside coordinate territory. By treating both positions as identical threats, the resulting eradication protocol routinely removes threshold-capable researchers. This destroys the specific inside class participants required to facilitate cross-class registration in the first place. Protecting the coupling architecture is the correct goal. Applying blunt, uniform elimination is a maximally destructive error that blinds the entire system to the very outside contact it requires. Evaluating the macro view of the dual-class system reveals both sides lack critical components. The inside class possesses vital coupling architecture for deep registration, but entirely lacks outside coordinate access. The outside coordinate class possesses limitless external access, but entirely lacks the coupling architecture required to stabilize data. Outside coordinate entities cannot simulate inside class architecture, and they cannot install it into themselves. For the exchange to happen, they are strictly dependent on an intact inside observer holding the line. The voluntary non-crosser functions as the irreplaceable linchpin of the entire contact experiment. They bear the load of both environments. They anchor the coupling architecture on the inside while opening the reality empathy channel to the outside. The framework that views the embedded position as a lower developmental state to be transcended is false. Standing at the threshold is not a tragic sacrifice, and it is not a consolation prize for failing to cross. The floor is not the bottom of a hierarchy. The floor is the literal, necessary ground of operation. The observer stands on it because standing on it is the only physical way to make the reach possible. Abandoning the inside class position, by attempting to cross the boundary, does not advance the experiment. It removes the core architectural participant. It unplugs the hardware required to receive the transmission. The voluntary non-crosser does not stay behind because they are unable to leave. They stay behind because they structurally comprehend the massive, irreplaceable power of what they hold intact.